Hi, I'm Reverend Kim Polchow from Marshfield United Methodist Church and the Streams MUMC YouTube channel. Welcome to episode 2, part 1 of the United Monarchy. We're going to talk about Saul, but before we talk about Saul, a couple things on the table. The first thing I want to talk to you about is Oklahoma. The state of Oklahoma, which is our neighbor from here in Missouri. I want to talk to you about a production of the Rodgers and Hammerstein play, Oklahoma, that I was in when I was in high school. So my hometown had a college that wanted to relaunch its theater program, and they did so by hosting a community theater production of Oklahoma, and I was cast in that show. Now, in Oklahoma, there is a perfect character foil. You have the main protagonist, Curly, who is this brash, bold, super confident, golden boy of a cowboy. Yeah, he's kind of arrogant, but he's a pretty good guy. He spins a good dream. He sings a good song. He's good looking. That's Curly. And he is after the hand of Lori. There's also someone else interested in Lori, and that's the hired hand, Judd. Judd is usually portrayed with a much darker countenance than Curly. He's kind of rough around the edges. He's the hired hand, and he is a little bit dangerous, even violent in the show. And the audience is not supposed to want Judd to be with Lori. They're supposed to want Curly to be with Lori. If you put Curly next to Judd, Curly looks a lot better. If you put Judd next to Curly, Judd looks a lot worse. That's a character foil used in a play, used in all kinds of literature, and we see character foils in Samuel. Character foils are a literary device used to contrast two characters, and it sort of highlights the goodness or the badness of one of the characters. Now, the play that I was in, the production of Oklahoma, the director made a really interesting choice. He cast one of the most beautiful men I have ever seen as Judd. He had dark, shiny, kind of shaggy hair. He was a dancer. He was absolutely gorgeous. And the way he portrayed Judd read much more bad boy than it did bad guy. And so when we got an audience into the theater, it was hard for the women to cheer for Curly because Judd actually looked pretty good standing next to Curly, and Curly looked kind of milquetoast next to Judd. It was such an interesting dynamic, and I really felt like it kind of made our production not work because the women were all not silently cheering for Judd. In the book of Samuel, we have character foils. You have Eli and Samuel sitting side by side at the beginning, one old, one young, one in charge of their family, one not in charge of their family. And then you move on and you have David and Saul. David and Saul are a major character foil. When Saul stands next to David, Saul looks so much worse. When David stands next to Saul, David looks so much better. And I sometimes wonder, when I read the actual stories of King Saul, if he really would be seen by history as such a terrible leader, if he hadn't been placed in history and in the biblical story right next to and in front of King David. We're going to talk about DTRH. DTRH is the hypothetical author in biblical scholarship of Samuel, but more than Samuel, DTRH is the author of a really long sort of standalone history of Israel and Judah from the days of Moses all the way through the fall of Judah. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years. How do Bible scholars know that one person wrote that long story? That's a really good question. It's about language use. It's about style, but mostly with DTRH, it's about theology. DTRH has a distinctive theological perspective. And because it has such a distinctive theological perspective, it's hard to see it as a book that is purely historical, even if, as we discussed in episode 1, we're not looking at it in the modern sense of the word historical, but if we're looking at it as like a retelling of the facts of the story or the basic story, that's not what DTRH is about. DTRH is about instructing future generations with a theological perspective, looking back at the history that it knows. Okay, so DTRH is, I'm going to tell you a story about the things that happened in the past so you know how not to mess up your day and the future. And you get that sense when you're reading DTRH that this is sort of an instruction manual telling us how to be. And if you have ever found yourself reading the Hebrew scriptures and going, wow, is this the same God that brought us Jesus? You might be reading DTRH because DTRH's theological perspective can be seen as particularly harsh. It is the theological perspective we often call blessings and curses. If you do this, you're blessed. If you do this, you're cursed. And so when you read the story of Israel and Judah's history from this perspective of DTRH, how well their countries or leaders or people do is a direct function of how faithful and obedient people have been to God. Because if you follow the law and you obey what it says, everything will be great. And if you don't, it won't be great because you'll be punished. That's blessings and curses theology, and that is the hallmark of DTRH. So where do you find DTRH in the Bible? Well, Deuteronomy is a good place to start, right? Because DTRH stands for the Deuteronomistic historian. Now, as an aside, if you have ever studied the four-source hypothesis or the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis, this is the hypothesis of how the first 5 books of the Bible were constructed by 4 sources, commonly known as J, E, D, and P. DTRH, or the Deuteronomistic historian, is that D source, that third source listed. If you aren't familiar with that theory, I'm going to give you the nutshell in a nutshell version. Basically, there is a voice in those first 5 books of the Bible that is from the Northern Territory. There is one that is particularly from the Southern Territory. There is this Deuteronomistic historian that tells this standalone story of Moses through the fall of Judah and has the blessings and curses theology. And last, there is a source that put a lot of these things together, the priestly source, that's the P, and that was put together during the exile. DTRH is also thought to have been written during the exile. And if you think about it, if all your scholars got taken off the land in an exile situation and you basically became refugees in another country, what do refugees do? They remember. They gather together and they shore up their sense of their own culture because that's the only way to survive in a foreign culture and not to be just consumed into it. So during this time in exile, the theory of most Bible scholars is that a lot of writing was happening. Oral traditions were being shared and written down and edited or redacted. That's the biblical term we use for editing. And these stories that we have today are a product of scholars and priests having the time and the interest in doing more than telling each other and their children and their grandchildren the stories, but actually writing them down because they were threatened in exile. So what does DTRH have to do with the United Monarchy? DTRH loved the United Monarchy. The very center of DTRH's long story that goes from Moses to the fall of Judah, the very center of that is King David. And the most material written in DTRH, like the character that gets the most play, even more than Moses, David. DTRH thinks David is not just the best king that Israel and Judah ever had. He is the king by which every other king will be judged, right? Because we go from David to the fall of Judah. And so we do have this record of sort of who they're judging against. They're judging against David. David is top dog. And in fact, that's why sometimes I use the phrase royal propaganda. It's not that this was, going out around in political rallies or anything like that, because thinking of it at political rallies would definitely be reflecting our culture back onto that time period. But it was sort of making the case like this was the glory, these were the glory days, these were the good times, this was the right king, this is when people acted right. It's that sort of apologetic work, like describing against people who might say something else why David was the absolute best. So that's DTRH, the Deuteronomistic historian who wrote Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, edited Samuel, and did the King's books. That's that whole story. And Samuel has lots of edits where, as I said in the first episode, there were several different traditions sort of sitting side by side and sometimes put together with transitions. That was DTRH's work. Probably DTRH took these older traditions and sort of stacked them together and did the redacting. And you can see that same blessings and curses theology, but it's sort of thrown in bits and pieces. To look at how DTRH shows up in the book of Samuel, we're going to take the first reading that I have given to the class to do. That's from 1 Samuel 10 and 11. But I want to back up and give you a little bit of a wider lens. Between 1 Samuel 9 and 1 Samuel 11, there are 3 stories of Saul becoming the king. 3 separate stories. And if you were to take out the words that seem to have been added by DTRH, it would very clearly be 3 separate times that Saul was chosen to be the king. The first in a private conversation with Samuel. The second in a sort of public setting. And the third because it was proven in battle. What DTRH does in this story is DTRH adds that little connection, like, well, this happened, but it was in private. Well, this happened, but he wasn't proven in battle. And voila, it's done. If you take those words out, you got 3 separate stories of Saul becoming king. That's a little bit weird. DTRH is the one who sort of smooths those stories out and makes it read like it's one continuous narrative. Bible scholars can pick out where DTRH is in text because they have so much of their material to analyze that it's pretty recognizable. That's a great set of readings. See if you can pick out DTRH's transition and maybe even, draw yourself a little dotted line between those stories so that you'll remember that in the future when you're reading your Bible. I will see you next in part 2 of episode 2. We're going to talk about Saul, who he was as king in a United Monarchy prequel.